I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all so very much for joining us, and thank you for your ongoing support. If you're enjoying our free webinars and would like to join the effort to keep them going, we've just launched a new platform that makes giving easier than ever before. Please stay tuned at the end of this program for details on how you can pledge your support. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's program, Is Climate Change the Biggest Environmental Concern? With Michael Shellenberger, founder and president of Environmental Progress and author of Apocalypse Never. Moderated by Benjamin Preston, who is a senior researcher and director of the Community Health and Environmental Policy Program at RAND. For those of you who are new to these webinars, we will be taking questions in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, and she always tries to get to as many of your questions as possible. Benjamin, thank you so much for moderating today's program. I turn this over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And thanks to all of you who've come online today and taken time out of your schedule to join yet another online conversation. Thanks in particular to Michael Shellenberger, who's going to talk with me and the rest of you about Apocalypse Never. So it's a fairly lengthy book. There's a lot of details within it. We've got a relatively short amount of time. So I want to start at a high level and then sort of dive into some of the details later on. But so for starters, Michael, what's the bottom line? Can you boil down sort of the take-home message from Apocalypse Never, and what is the message you want to leave people with when they walk away from this webinar?
Sure, thanks, Benjamin. So the argument of Apocalypse Never is in the subtitle, which is environmental alarmism hurts us all, that environmental problems are real, climate change is real, climate's not the end of the world, climate change is not the end of the world, and it's led us to ignore other environmental problems that I think are more serious. And it's also led us to engage in a set of behaviors that I think have been both harmful to people and the environment. So two big areas. One is that the alarmism has clearly had negative mental health consequences. I think it's very clear now that the climate alarmism we've seen over the last couple of years has contributed to rising anxiety and depression, including among adolescents who frankly have enough to worry about. Particularly the advent of social media, I think, has contributed to rising social anxiety. And then more globally, I document the ways in which climate alarmism has been used to deprive poor countries cheap energy. So right now, the World Bank has almost entirely diverted funding that used to go to basic infrastructure of development, roads, electrical grids, sewage systems, flood control, hydroelectric dams, cheap and reliable power plants, to charitable endeavors, workshops, basically solar panels and batteries for villagers, basically efforts to keep people in their villages and try to improve their lives very modestly, but not actually drive economic development. And I point out that many of the things that have been promoted for climate mitigation, particularly renewables, actually end up expanding humankind's environmental impact. So it takes about 300 to 400 times more land to generate the same amount of electricity from a solar farm as a natural gas plant or a nuclear plant. And if you were to go 100% renewables, we'd have to expand the amount of land that we use for energy production from about 0.5% to somewhere between 25 and 50%. So the first third of the book is sort of a debunking of popular myths on climate change, deforestation, species extinction, plastic waste. The middle part of the book is a description of how humans actually save nature in the real world. We've really only heard half the story from the environmental movement for 50 years about how humans destroy the environment. This is about how we save it. And then the last third looks at why, if environmental problems are real but manageable, did we come to see them as the end of the world? Did we come to see them as apocalyptic? And why did we come to see solutions that I think are worse for the environment, like renewables, as solutions to environmental problems?
Great, that's a fantastic overview, and I think that's probably whetted the appetite for some of the folks who are calling in who haven't quite dug into it. So there's a lot there, and as you just articulated, there's information about science, about energy, about development, about international affairs. So if that's the key message, who do you think is the important audience? Like, who at the end of the day do you want to actually read this and walk away with that take-home message?
I mean, I had a lot of different people in my mind for this book. I mean, on the one hand, the book is for environmentalists, people like me who care about the environment. It's something they think about. They want to know what works, what doesn't work. I definitely also wrote it for teenagers. I dedicated the book to my kids. My daughter's 14, my son is 21. I tried to fill the book with it's a commercial book of nonfiction, so it's a science journalism is what you would call it. And so, but I think it moves quickly. I wanted to tell a lot of stories. I wanted to have sympathetic characters. In most of the chapters, the main character is an environmentalist. It's somebody who is doing important work, somebody who I recognize is doing important work. We may not agree on everything, but usually they're kind of cast as the heroes and raising a bunch of these questions themselves. I also had, I was also thinking kind of politically, I wanted to also write this for conservatives, not just for liberals, because I think that conservatives have been portrayed as anti-environmental, and I don't think that is the case for most people. I don't think most people are anti-nature. Most people want clean air, clean water. Most people want to preserve wildlife. But what we've seen in recent years, particularly the last 20, 30 years, is a kind of climate skepticism that has sometimes been called climate denialism, which I think has been a reaction to the radicalism of a lot of the apocalyptic environmental demands by conservatives, by Republicans. And I wanted to say, you know, look, the basic science of climate change I defend in the book. I think it's basically right. Humans are warming the planet. It's not the end of the world. It's something we should deal with. But it was definitely an effort to help conservatives have a kind of environmental perspective that neither denied environmental problems nor embraced what I see as sort of the knee-jerk response, which is that we have to choose between the economy and the environment. I mean, you see that on both sides. There's some sense in which we need to be poorer or use more primitive technologies to save the natural environment. I make the opposite argument that we need to protect the environment. You actually need to use more advanced technologies. So we go from wood to coal to natural gas to uranium. For nuclear plants, every step along that way, the human footprint shrinks as we get more energy out of less natural resource. So I guess the book is for everybody, but also for some specific groups as well.
That's great. And I want to follow up on that. I mean, so you've just sort of touched on this issue of climate denialism, and you know that's a label that's being attached to you, at least in the social media realm. You know, and in talking about sort of messages to conservatives, I mean, I've been working on climate change for 20 odd years, and 20 years ago, it was sort of the scientific community and environmental NGOs are the ones that were sort of talking about this. And over time, we've seen evolution where you have, you know, non-traditional organizations like security organizations, Department of Defense, who at times have come out and said things about risks of climate change. And certainly the private sector is, you know, stepping into this realm, and some of which are even arguing for the need for aggressive action to address this problem. So what's driving that? How much of that is, I guess, the sort of widespread rational view that there are real risks to deal with, versus how much of this is, as you say, a response to, you know, what people see is happening? You know, so issues of transition risk, pricing in concerns about people placing a price on carbon, where like corporations are saying, well, look, if this is what the landscape is going to look like, we have to manage that risk. And that's kind of a different argument than, you know, full-fledged belief that, you know, there really is an emergency.
Yeah, so the last three chapters sort of look at, you know, these issues of why, if these are manageable problems, did we come to see them as apocalyptic? And then it also looks at why, if renewables actually expand the human footprint, or, you know, I also make the same argument with bioplastics. I think bioplastics are worse for the environment. I show that they're worse for the environment than plastics that derive from petroleum. And so where does that come from? There's a lot of different things. I mean, your average person who goes to the grocery store and buys a product marked natural, that's just appeal to nature fallacy. It's just this idea that things that are natural are good. There's not a lot of thinking in there. There's a second group, which are more the leaders of the environmental movement, who they're inheritors of an ideology that is based on a British economist named Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus argued that humans were doomed to have more children than there would be food for, and that we would have these recurring famines. It was wrong back in 1798. It's been wrong ever since. If it were correct, then there wouldn't be 7.5 billion people on Earth. There would still be just a billion or 2 billion. We are able to control, we obviously have fewer kids now as you grow wealthier, and we're able to grow huge quantities of food. We have 25% food surpluses every year. It's astonishing quantities of food. So what's going on there? Why are people doing that? I mean, I look at money, power, and religion, and where the book ultimately goes is it sort of argues that environmentalism is the dominant religion of secular global elites, particularly people who no longer are adherents to traditional religion, whether Judeo-Christianity or Hinduism. And I argue that I point to this large body of psychological research, which shows that all humans have a understandable fear of death, and that we repress that fear, but then we construct a particular story of our lives that give us a sense of immortality. And so traditional religions, we believe that if we behaved well during our lives, that we would go to heaven after we died, or you'd be reincarnated in some higher way for some Eastern religions. Well, as people stop believing in those religions, we still have a need to construct a story of ourselves as heroic. So I think that's been a big part of environmental activism. I don't think that that's anything necessarily wrong with it. I think there's something wrong with not understanding that that's what we're doing. In other words, for the most part, if you're Christian or Jewish or Hindu, you might say, I'm Christian, that's my faith, but then I pay attention to the science because I know we need science to make the world a better place. What we've seen with a lot of apocalyptic environmentalists is they suggest that they tell a religious story, the end is coming because we're being punished for our sins, and they think they're telling a scientific story. And I think that's animating a lot of it. But other things like advocates of carbon pricing and pricing nature more broadly, I think comes out of just this dominant paradigm that we've had since the late 70s, early 80s, which you might call neoliberalism, which basically thinks that there's market solutions to everything. I defend markets in my book, particularly as it relates to energy transitions. We stopped using whales when we developed alternative substitutes, first petroleum, then vegetable oil. But I don't think that fundamentally we solve environmental problems through markets. And in fact, I think some of it's very backwards. We mostly save nature because we don't need it anymore. So we saved the whales because we didn't need them for their whale oil anymore. It's the idea that we saved the whales because suddenly we decided whales were spiritual beings. That's just not true. In fact, Greenpeace doesn't really show up to saving whales until about 10 years after the peak of whaling. So I think that much of the carbon pricing emphasis, the pricing nature, I think rests on a bunch of bad assumptions. You know, for example, the amount of land that humans use for agriculture appears to have peaked and is going down. That's certainly happening for livestock and pasture, which is great news because that's the single biggest source of the human impact on the natural environment. But that's occurring just because we're better at growing more food on less land. It's not because we put a price on nature. It's not because we put a cost on it. And so I also wanted to illuminate, that's the second part of the book, why I think we need to understand that there's a physical reality to energy in the environment, and that as we move towards more power dense food and energy production, more food on less land, more electricity produced from less resources and land, the better. And that there's just a straightforward physical relationship there.
So the book presents lots of examples of, I guess, countering conventional wisdom around the environment, you know, whether it's climate change, other environmental issues, you know, economic losses from disasters relative to GDP been going down sort of around the world. Famine is less common and vanishingly less common than it was previously. Overall, air quality in many places improved, water quality in many places improved, certainly not everywhere. So that's those are kind of some of the realities on the ground. But yet, you know, people like to anchor on certain things. So I'm sitting here in Southern California. California's had a fairly unpleasant wildfire seasons of the past several years, significant property damage, loss of life, you know, poor air quality. And that's happening in a state that is otherwise quite progressive on environmental issues and climate change. And behind all of this is actual science linking some of these things together around the margins, questions around attribution. Can we attribute marginal increases in wildfires or big wildfires to climate change? But I guess for those people who are sort of living through these disasters and are concerned of the environment and maybe human impacts that are contributing to these things, what is the right level of concern? So how should we think about these types of events, given that there are people out there who are rightly concerned to extent about what they're seeing out their windows?
Yeah, so let's just talk a little bit about disasters generally, and then I'll talk a little about forest fires. And I'm in Berkeley, I think, and you're in LA, right? So we share these concerns about fires in our state. So the first thing is that on natural disasters, disasters refers to damage to people and property. It's not an extreme weather event. That's a different thing. So in other words, a hurricane, it can be a really huge hurricane, but if it never touches ground, it's not a disaster. It's an extreme weather event. This book defends the IPCC science. I have no complaint with the IPCC science. The end of the book, I complain about how the IPCC writes its summaries for policymakers and its press releases and some of the statements that scientists make, but that's a separate issue. That's science communication. So I accept that climate change is making some extreme weather events more severe. However, I object to the claim that climate change is making natural disasters worse, because natural disasters are getting better. And in fact, this is something we should celebrate. Deaths from natural disasters globally have declined 92% since over the last 100 years. That's a decadal average to avoid cherry picking. We've seen that 80 to 90% decline in deaths from natural disasters over the last 40 years. Some of this is due just to better weather forecasting and storm shelters in places like South Asia, particularly on the Indian Ocean, where when a cyclone comes, cyclones should not kill anybody anymore, just like hurricanes shouldn't kill anybody anymore. I mean, they may still, but it shouldn't be for lack of technological or infrastructural support. So that's something we should celebrate. There's really hasn't been an argument about that. I've had some people that say, Michael, you're being misleading because you say natural disasters are becoming better, but look, we can find climate change in extreme weather events. That's fine. That's changing the thing we're talking about right in mid-sentence. And so I object to some of that slipperiness. Let's talk about fires in particular, because they're really interesting. So one thing I will say about this book is I knew that what I was saying would be controversial. So I published all of the basic science in a series of columns for Forbes, where I'm a contributor, last year. I made sure all the scientists that are quoted in them, that they saw them. There was chances for them to correct or ask for a fact check. That never happened. On forest fires, what I point out is that two factors for two different kind of forests really are are what's behind more frequent and more severe fires. The first is the accumulation of wood fuels in mountain forests, like the Sierras. We used to have controlled burns. Burning in most mountain forests have regular fires that burn the underbrush. It's a natural part of the fire forest cycle. And then there's other forests like the chaparral or the brushland areas is what they're called. Like think about Malibu in LA, or think about those amazing coastal fires that you have. Those can entirely be explained by more people living near forests. I mean, we love our natural environment so much in California that we want to live right near them, right in them. It's why we're here, right? So that's what explains that. Now, one of the scientists who's really one of the top scientists on this, I interviewed him. He said, we can see a climate signal from the 60s in forests. And I just asked him, that's the same period though where we stopped doing controlled burns. And so how do we know that it's from climate as opposed to from controlled burns? And he just said, we don't know. He said he thought it was an interesting question. He's going to look at it some more. So, I mean, I agree that climate change is definitely lengthening the fire season. It's definitely have hotter temperatures. Of course, that's going to result in stronger fires or more fires, but it's not. We can't see that because these other two big factors are so determinative. And so I try to make this real for people because it can get abstract. So in the first chapter of the book, I go to the Congo and I talk about flooding, and I interview a small farmer there named Bernadette. She's in her late 20s at the time. You know, her life is obviously very difficult. Her sweet potatoes have been eaten the night before by baboons. I was there to see the wildlife and appreciate the wildlife. She was trying to defend her life from the wildlife. But then I talk about, like, I live in the Berkeley Hills, and so when it rains, we've got this incredible system of gutters and culverts and ways to divert the water, a flood management system. It's a beautiful flood management system. So could climate change result in more precipitation in Berkeley? Yeah, for sure. Like, definitely a few more inches of precipitation a year. We're rich in Berkeley, so we're gonna just adjust our flood control system. For Bernadette in the Congo, she has no flood control system, so when it rains and it floods, their homes are filled with water, like their homes get flooded. So I think to attribute the flooding in places like Congo to climate change is really misleading, and yet that's what a lot of environmentalists have done, and we've ignored the fact that Bernadette, they just need a flood control system. They need some system to control flood. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything about climate change. We should, but I wanted to kind of bring back some because I think it's those of us that are in the rich world, we just don't even see these systems anymore. Like, we don't even realize, we take it for granted. And that's why I think going to poor countries is helpful, because you get there and you realize, oh, okay, so when you don't have that flood control system, your life is just mayhem for the rainy season.
Yeah. So, question for you, is this a conventional understanding around climate disasters, consequences? Is our understanding, or sort of general public's understanding, is it just too simple? Are there just too many nuances? So whether it's wildfires in California, I've been working on disaster recovery in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, whether it's in the U.S. or internationally, you know, there seems to be this tendency to say big disaster, aha, climate change, and we miss a lot of the nuances, which is, okay, well, this part, you know, is baseline variability. This part is, you know, the climate change piece. This part is land use, you know, decision making, how cultural responses to impacts. And it seems like for all these situations, they're just, you know, amazingly complex, but yet we just continue to sort of boil these things down to one individual cause that seems to sit nicely in a headline.
Yeah, I think that's right, Benjamin. I mean, you know, like Hurricane Katrina, you know, the Ninth Ward, which was flooded. First of all, the levees broke. It was under sea level. You know, if the levees hadn't broke, it wouldn't matter that there would be a little bit more intense, you know, wind speed for those hurricanes. Hurricane Sandy that hit New York, they needed to have modernized their flood control system. I mean, you just kind of go, that's the, you know, and you look around the world. I give this example of the Netherlands, which has remained confusing for people, but I always like to refer to it. You know, the Netherlands becomes a rich country while farming below sea level, at some places 7 meters below sea level. And as you know, the IPCC, the median estimate for sea level rise this century is 0.6 meters, which is about 2 feet. 7 meters is, you know, 21 feet. So clearly, and if you've ever been to Venice, Italy, I mean, what an incredible achievement. So clearly humans are able to adapt to extraordinary situations. You know, we're incredibly capable. And what I have a problem with is I think there's a framing of humans as these sort of helpless victims of our environments. Well, the whole reason we have big environmental problems and the problems that we all concern about is because we're not helpless victims of our environment. We're able to completely dominate the earth. I mean, humans our footprint is enormous. 7.5 billion of us. We use about half of the ice-free surface of the earth. We use the best parts, you know, the most fertile parts. And so that's the problem. We're taking up all the habitat for wild animals. We're killing all the wild animals. It's not because humans are helpless in our natural circumstances. And so I get into, you'll see it in the book, you know, I have this kind of argument with the lead author of one of the IPCC reports on sea level rise. He's quoted calling sea level rise unmanageable. And I was like, what do you mean by unmanageable? And he points to things like Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy, or even in the 50s when the dikes in the Netherlands failed and thousands of people were killed. And it's like, okay, yes, there's disasters, but unmanageable makes it sound like somehow you're going to be in like a Mad Max Road Warrior movie, and that's just not like, and so are we going to need to retreat from some coastlines? Yeah. Are some island nations potentially, going to have to migrate? Yeah. That's not the end of the world. And even in comparison to a lot of other big environmental problems, I think don't get enough emphasis. I wouldn't put it up there as one of our highest priorities.
Yeah. Okay, so you referred a couple of times to the IPCC. So I want to bring that in part because, it's an international body. For those, on the line aren't familiar, this was the scientific body established about 30 years ago to advise the United Nations and the sort of climate treaty negotiation process, in part to take some of the sort of international controversy out, create one body that can be sort of the gold standard for science. And Michael, in your book, you basically say, look, you read these reports, they generally get the science right, they do a thorough job. And you talk about the sort of summary for policymakers as being this place where politics starts to infiltrate. And I'm an IPCC author myself, in full disclosure, and I've certainly have concerns about that, having seen how those summaries get written in practice. But other folks come at it from the other side, right? Which is, well, in order to write these summaries, you have, almost 200 nations have to agree on the content. And so you have sort of pro climate action countries, effectively lobbying for certain types of statements. And you have countries like Saudi Arabia that are not so pro climate action, lobbying for statements. And some argue that the reason why the summary works is because you have to find language that works for everyone, sort of regardless of their perspective. So, and I think this debate is often about, grass is always greener. I don't know, but there's always this sort of idea, both from the right and the left. The left says, it's all about climate denialism, and the right says, well, it's just climate alarmism. How do we get to the middle? What is a reasonable perspective? How do we understand which information is the good, reliable, trustworthy information? Who do we go to?
Yeah, well, that's such an interesting question right now, because it seems, I think my book is coming out at a time when I just think the biggest institutions in our society are really have lost trust and credibility. So, the presidency. I'm a Democrat, but I say that just even I think most Republicans would kind of go, you don't. This president isn't somebody that I think we kind of go is a reliable source of information. I think even most Trump supporters would not say that. But then you also get to the World Health Organization, and major public health officials that were actively saying masks weren't important when we now know they were really important. And in fact, we knew they were important back in 1918. You have the New York Times, which it's no longer clear that it's actually trying to be objective newspaper anymore. So you have, I think, institutions that are really in crisis around the world. I think because we are coming out of a period of a kind of neoliberal economic framework and a globalizing framework, and we're reverting back to nationalism. I think those institutions can recover with new leadership that have new ideas. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to ever have, newspapers that are considered like the paper of record anymore. Nor am I sure that that's possible for scientific bodies. And I'm not sure it's desirable either. And, in other words, maybe this is a point at which, we're all having to just mature ourselves to accepting the fact that all knowledge is contested and subjective. And, because in other words, I look at it and I go, I'm fine with the IPCC reports. I have trouble when I get to the summary for policymakers. I have a lot more trouble with the press releases and statements. Do we need the summaries? In other words, would it be the worst thing in the world for a liberal newspaper and a conservative newspaper to write their own summaries? And as a reader, you might read them both and try to find the truth in it. So I think there's definitely this fragmentation, this fracturing of expertise and of institutional bodies. I'm not sure that it may be inevitable. It may not. Maybe that there's nothing that we can do about that. I think that certainly bothers people. I think it threatens people. It also gives opportunities for people. I write this column for Forbes. It's not as prestigious as the New York Times, but a lot of my stories, I feel like I beat the New York Times. I do a better job covering it, in my opinion. And then when somebody, and I do get fact checked. I mean, almost every article, somebody tries to point something out. And when they're right, I correct it and I put it on Twitter and I go, this was wrong, and I've corrected it in the article. And for me, I think that's that dynamic and that the kind of the greater intimacy that you have, for example, with social media is the one example, I think is great. I think is really positive. Obviously, there's all sorts of other trouble, but I'm not sure that we'll ever be able to go back to that era where you had a single scientific body that everybody thought was the right one, or a single newspaper or something. It just seems much more fractured than that.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to tee up one more issue, but then I want to turn it over to our audience because we'll get a much greater sort of diversity of questions. But future of energy, right? I mean, you made some earlier comments about renewables and environmental externalities around renewables. So what does it look like? What's the pathway forward, in your opinion, for how do we get to sort of a more sustainable energy future, and how far off of that trajectory are we right now?
Yeah, so it's taken me like 15 years to get here, but my view of energy is actually really simple, which is that there is truly an energy ladder that is both that has physical properties that also have moral and economic properties. So small farmers like Bernadette in the Congo, they use wood and dung and charcoal as their primary source of energy. It's the worst fuel at every level in terms of the amount of time and labor it takes, which is what poor people mostly complain about when they have to use them. But also the smoke is the worst. Then they move to what they call liquefied petroleum gas, which is basically functions like natural gas in poor countries, but it's in canisters. Huge improvement. You can just cook like we cook, and you don't have to chop, haul, or wood. But you need money for that, so you need industrialization. So my view is that wood and dung to coal is progress. Coal to natural gas is also wonderful. I mean, we all know natural gas is just much cleaner than coal on every metric, including half as much carbon. We burn it in our homes. And then natural gas to uranium, in my view, for nuclear is another positive transition. So people say to me, are you pro natural gas? And I say, I'm pro natural gas when it replaces coal, wood, dung, and everything below it, but not when it replaces uranium. So, energy forecasting is pointless in some ways. Nobody's very good at predicting this. So I think it's more important to just kind of have that basic moral view. Now, I think nuclear is always been different and always special, which is why this book, in some ways, this book started as a nuclear book and it expanded, and nuclear still runs through it. Uranium for nuclear is such a radical event. Right now, natural gas is so cheap and so abundant globally, it's replacing coal on its own. The natural gas industry doesn't need anybody's help. It's fine. Like, in fact, I mean, there are actually so much oil and gas in the world that the companies are going bankrupt. And that's a sign of its success. Nuclear is different because nuclear came out of a bomb program and is fundamentally a dual use technology. It was so radical and so shocking that people are still very scared of the technology. So the main barrier to the expansion of nuclear energy, which I view as the only way to actually solve climate change, full stop. I just don't think you can mitigate climate change without transitioning to nuclear. The main obstacle is public fear of the technology. And it's a very tricky issue because we should be afraid of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, like, that's how they work, is by scaring the pants off of everybody, right? That's why China and India only pretend to go to war with each other. Both sides are like, that's not going to happen. The power plants cannot explode like a bomb. They're the safest way to make electricity. All of the stuff around Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, it's just all psychological projection onto the technology with an exaggerated response because of the fears of the bomb and some manipulations by these Malthusian scientists in the 60s. But for me, and it's why much of my life I've spent trying to make the case for nuclear, I think that it is the greatest technology. We can't get rid of it. I mean, that's part of it. There was this idea that we could somehow get rid of it. You can't, for a variety of reasons we could talk about. So for me, and that's what I love about the technology, it's such a difficult, controversial, problematic technology. But once I think people see it for what it really is, it will just be increasingly adopted. But I don't think, like, for the most part, I don't think I don't need to spend any of my time persuading people that natural gas is better than coal. Like everybody knows that. Nor do I need to persuade poor countries that they'd be better off with coal-fired electricity rather than burning wood. But nuclear remains deeply, it's like almost a spiritual problem. It creates so much unease that for me, the 21st century, when you think about environmental activism, for me, that should be one of the highest priorities, is emphasizing the need for nuclear, both to mitigate climate change, but also to just shrink the human environmental footprint to really, at least in terms of energy, to almost nothing.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, so I think we've hopefully teed up enough that our audience's brains have been working and have questions for themselves. So I'm going to turn things over to Jessica to move to the audience participation portion of our webinar.
Great, thank you so much. We have a ton of questions coming in. Michael, I'll jump right to it. How much of the global grid can nuclear provide using the current generation of reactors? How rapidly do you think we'll be able to transition to the next generation of reactors?
Right. So, I mean, so my view is that eventually we'll be 100% nuclear. The question is when. That, I mean, it could be 2200. It's unlikely, and I mean all of the energy, by the way. So, just roughly, electricity is about a third. Cooking and heating is about a third, and then transportation, which is almost entirely petroleum, is about a third of our energy. So France has gotten the most. It's gotten to almost 80% at its height nuclear for electricity. So it's not hard to get to 100%. They can. There are various ways to kind of ramp it up and down during different seasons and different parts of the day. But there's really no obstacle. There's no physical or technical or economic obstacle to having nuclear provide 100% of our electricity now, and then eventually be providing the electricity to replace cooking and heating, which is usually natural gas in our homes, or to be providing the electricity or hydrogen gas for transportation. There's no physical, economic, or technical barrier. It's mostly psychological and spiritual and political, in that there's a lot of interests that obviously would be competing with nuclear that don't want nuclear, and I document in my book the natural gas and renewables interests arguing against it. Then there's a question of, Bill Gates and others have made a big show about having supposedly developed better nuclear. Here's what we know from the science. The only way we know to make nuclear safer and cheaper is by having the same people build, manage, operate, and regulate the same kind of reactors over and over again. So the costs of building nuclear come down when it's the same people building the same kind of reactor over and over again. It's just like even solar panels works that way. It's just more repetition, more standardization. Conversely, when nuclear becomes expensive, it's when we keep changing the design. So I think that this desire to have a different kind of nuclear, you hear a lot about thorium, there's different coolant, which is different fuel. I think it's pointless. I mean, because thorium actually mutates into uranium before it can be fissioned. So, it's kind of confusing to people, but really it's about the coolant combination. Some people think if you use water, it's inherently more dangerous, because if you have a loss of water, then the reactor cores can melt, which is what happened at 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. That's true, but it suggests that you wouldn't have other problems with different fuel coolant combinations, which include using chemicals like fluoride and beryllium or lithium to really combine with the uranium, or they use sodium, which is a metal in liquid form that would combine. So my view is that this effort to change the technology stems from some desire to make nuclear something that it's not, which is that it is also this new gunpowder, and there's no way in which you can totally separate them. Now, to be clear, you can have nuclear power plants and not have weapons. You can agree to that. You can have inspectors. That's mostly how it works for countries that have nuclear power plants but no weapons. Nonetheless, humankind's ability to split the atom, which comes right out of science, like they literally are able to split the atom in the lab with hardly any money. It's just a simple experiment. There's no way, we figured out there's no way to get rid of that knowledge. Even if we killed every nuclear scientist and engineer in the world, it would come right back out of the science. So for me, I see this desire to move to a different design as an effort to somehow find a technical fix to the social anxiety that nuclear creates. My view is, since that's not possible, it's better to just openly confront the fears that people have and recognize that, you know, really what makes nuclear cheaper, safer, and better is by sticking with incremental improvements and standardization of the water-cooled reactors that we currently have.
That's interesting. We hosted Richard Rhodes a few years ago, and he described that in France, every single nuclear reactor is built the same way. So if there's one little failure in one of them, they can instantly go to check the others and address the repairs, you know, sooner, rather than having all these different models across the country. Okay, next, why, other than storage, is there a problem with needing more land for renewable when we have adequate open land and/or the land can be multi-purposed?
Well, the answer is because we don't have as much land as people might think, and it can't be multi-purposed in many cases. So, you know, I mean, I guess you could say if you don't care about the natural environment, then just cover it all with solar panels and wind turbines. But if you care about the natural environment, if you care about wild animals and habitat, you want to have a smaller footprint. But there's also an economic issue. I mean, if you need 300 to 400 times more land for solar and wind farms than you do for a natural gas and nuclear plant, and nobody should take my word for it. What's cool right now about Google Maps is that if you right-click, you can draw around anything on Google Maps. So you can find a power plant on Google Maps, draw a line around it, and then divide that area into the amount of electricity that that plant produces every year, and you come up with your power density number, and you can compare. So no one should take my word, but it's basically 300 to 400 times more land is required for solar and wind farms as a nuclear plant. According to Václav Smil, who is one of the most respected energy analysts, for the most part, I try to rely on other scholars for their research so that I am not accused of having created numbers to fit my purpose. He calculates that going from today's energy system to 100% renewable would require increasing the amount of land we use for energy from 0.5% to between 25 and 50%. It's inconceivable that that would occur. It'd be disastrous. But let's talk about solar and wind more specifically. Industrial wind turbines are large propellers. They're large spinning blades that we are putting into the airshed, into what you would call habitat for insects, bats, and birds. Wind is used by those species to travel, to move, to eat, to hunt. And so it's inevitable, because nature's everywhere. That's like the first thing you're supposed to learn when you become an environmentalist. There's nature everywhere, even in the desert, even in places where you maybe can't see it. You know, I give the example of the California desert. We have these desert tortoises, these magnificent animals. It's the state reptile. You know, to build the famous solar farm Ivanpah, which Google financed, DOE financed, they literally had to pull desert tortoises out of their burrows, put them on the back of pickup trucks. Many of them ended up getting killed. So there isn't a dual use. Usually you have to clear the whole area. And then in terms of the industrial wind turbines, we see them being blocked all around the world. So on Lake Erie, they just required, they didn't explicitly block it, but they required that the blade stop spinning when migratory bird species are in the area. So it made the whole project uneconomical. In Northern California, they blocked a big project in the redwoods because they were worried about the impact on the marbled murrelet, which is a seabird. And in Nebraska, a judge just put an injunction on a new transmission line that would bisect the sand hills, which is this pristine sand dune ecosystem, intact sand dune ecosystem, because of the potential impacts on whooping cranes and other endangered species. Whooping cranes can hit the transmission lines and get killed. There's hardly any whooping cranes left in the world. So when you expand the human footprint, it inevitably is taking habitat from endangered species. And we're seeing basically conservationists in Germany, Netherlands, all over Europe, the United States, blocking the expansion of solar and wind projects precisely because of their large impacts on landscapes.
Thank you. What do you make of Biden's emerging climate/energy agenda? How does it fit with the framework you lay out on best ways to address the challenge without an apocalyptic approach?
Well, I'm a lifelong Democrat, and I am going to vote for Biden because I just think the country's become too chaotic. But I'm not crazy about this climate plan. It does put too much on renewables. There's no provision to keep or expand existing nuclear. There's a little bit of money they're throwing at R&D, but it basically leaves everything. It's the same similar framework that I proposed 15 years ago in sort of the original Green New Deal, which we called a New Apollo project. Just too much emphasis on renewables and efficiency. Energy efficiency always sounds great. There's always these promises, but what the studies of the Obama stimulus investments in weatherization showed is that it ended up costing twice as much to do the efficiency than they gathered in the energy savings. And then in terms of renewables, it's just all the problems I described. I don't think it could work even if they tried to do it. I just think there's still too much local opposition to those projects. So that's my concern. I think that, I mean, I have a hard time believing that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is like a dyed-in-the-wool anti-nuclear person. She just seems too young to have been kind of caught in that anti-nuclear trap like some of the baby boomers were. But I just think it's, for me, I just, you kind of look at the nuclear option and you start to wonder, why are we doing all the solar and wind when we could just expand the number of reactors at nuclear power plants around the country?
Thank you. Are the alarmist messages from hardcore environmentalists trying to scare people into activism, or are they valid concerns we can all address together?
Well, at the end of the book, I address this. I talk about sort of money, power, and religion, and I think that there is a lot of people who are climate alarmists, environmental alarmists. Like, the alarmism is the goal in and of itself. I think that people derive, and I think some pleasure at raising the alarm. It's sort of exciting to scare people. Plus, you can then sort of raise up your own status by talking about how I'm preventing the end of the world in this heroic way by not flying or not eating meat or not driving. So I think it serves some basic psychological needs. I think one question is it okay to exaggerate some problems in order to solve them? And I guess I would just ask, what do we think are good examples of that? In other words, if I were like a cancer doctor at a UCLA hospital or some oncologist, and somebody was going around saying, in 10 years, we're all going to die from cancer, or billions of people will die from cancer. I may be somebody really committed to solving cancer, but I'm not sure I'm on board with that. That sort of fear-mongering strikes me as unhelpful. I mean, I've been looking for examples where alarmism has actually resulted in something positive, and I can't seem to find it. I keep finding examples where we raise concerns about a problem and we deal with it, but it just has become so unhinged. I mean, I'll just give you one example on the disasters. The assumption is that more people in the future will die from natural disasters than are dying today. I can't figure out how anybody comes up with that. IPCC certainly does not say that. IPCC does not predict anybody dying of climate change in the future. It says climate change is contributing to diseases, but that it's also outweighed by these other factors, like we mentioned before, fresh, clean water, sewage systems, and the like. So, but when I interview my daughter's friends, my daughter's fine because I talked to her, but she's 14. Her friends aren't sure that they're going to live long enough to have kids. 1 out of 5 British children have nightmares about climate change. Over 50% of American adolescents say they're very scared of climate change. I just think it's just gone really too far. And we've just got some other big problems. I mean, my next book is going to be about the homeless crisis we have in California. We have 75,000 people living on the streets in Los Angeles, San Francisco, many of them severely mentally ill, using heroin and meth every day, which is the worst thing for everybody, for mentally ill people. I don't see climate change putting 75,000 people on the street. We got 75,000 people on the street now. We're not dealing with that. So I feel like it became so total and so overwhelming that it's just distracted us both from other environmental problems, but from other problems that we just need to deal with right now.
You're ambitious trying to fix all these problems. Several people have asked about nuclear waste. So, you haven't addressed that yet. If you could talk a little bit about how nuclear waste is being dealt with in new reactors and any security concerns that people have around these nuclear power plants.
So nuclear waste is why nuclear is the cleanest and safest form of energy. What do I mean by that? So when you take your environmental studies 101 in college, what they teach you is they say eventually we want to have modes of production for anything, food, energy, products, consumer products, that don't emit any pollution into the environment. So pollution is just waste emitted into the natural environment, either into the air or the water or some other way. That's what we refer to as pollution. Nuclear is the only form of energy production that contains all of its waste on site, at the site of production, at the power plant. It emits no air or water pollution, assuming the plant is functioning normally. It's kind of everything you would want out of an environmental, out of a sustainable or circular energy technology. The waste, the high level waste refers to the used fuel rods, usually, about 12 feet high, that are used in the plant for a couple of years. They cool in water and then they're stored in dry cask storage outside of production. For me, it's not a problem because it's already solved. It's stored right there on site. Now, there's the nuclear industry and activists have often said we need to move the waste and bury it underground. I've never heard a single good argument for doing that. I don't know why you would need to put it underground. Seems like a waste of money to me. It's perfectly fine where it is on site. There's no lack of room. There's tiny quantities of it. I just actually tweeted over the weekend the nuclear waste repository in the Netherlands, and it's just this single small building, like a small warehouse, painted orange, says E equals MC square on the side. Inside this, it's a climate controlled building. They store both the low level and the high level waste in it. They also store some of the most precious artworks of the Netherlands. They have these incredible, so they have these, and the waste is kept, by the way, in steel and concrete. So they'll have people visiting this art gallery, and on one side is the nuclear waste, and on the other side are these beautiful tapestries from hundreds of years ago. For me, that's perfect. That's what you would want out of an energy source. I know there's some people that say we should take the used fuel because indeed it contains 90% of its original energy and recycle it. Sure, 2100, 2200. If we're ready to do that, then that's fine. But as an environmentalist, when I think of waste problems, nuclear waste is literally at the bottom of the list. I would worry about the plastic waste in the ocean. I would worry about the human waste in poor countries that makes people sick and kills people still. I'd worry about the wind turbine waste, which goes to landfills, is not recyclable. Solar panel waste, it takes 200 to 300 times more. Solar panels produce about 200 to 300 times more waste than nuclear. So in the book, I argue that the concern with waste is a form of psychological displacement of fears about the bomb, and that the waste is viewed as potential little bombs. It's all mostly unconscious and irrational, but I think that's where it's coming from. And that's why I've been trying to put up photographs that just goes, here it is. It's not liquid. It's not green. It's not like what they showed in The Simpsons. And it's really the only form of waste from energy production that we have a solution to.
Thank you. I think this will be our final question. In the US, a major part of our wealth comes from the energy sector. It's a campaign issue. It's a national security issue. We've been in wars over it. Your idea about returning to nuclear throws a wrench into a lot of that. Are there economic models on how the US pivots to nuclear energy and away from coal, natural gas, and other forms of energy?
Great question. So yeah, we are working right now on what we're calling a green nuclear deal. What would that look like? I think what would be in the national interest and also in our environmental interest is to scale up nuclear and export our natural gas and oil to other countries. Now, there's a lot of natural gas and oil, but that's fine. Basically, there's no reason really anymore to burn coal. Most countries should be able to get natural gas at amounts cheaper or about the same price as coal. And it seems like that should be just, if you care about climate change or air pollution, that should just be a huge priority. Let's get our natural gas. What Russia, UAE, and other countries that have a lot of natural gas and oil are doing is they're doing precisely this. They're building nuclear plants to provide their domestic consumption and export their oil and gas abroad. For me, that would be the most important thing. I right now, the U.S. nuclear industry, I'm having an increasingly public disagreement with the U.S. nuclear industry. I'm lucky because I don't accept any industry funding, so I can criticize people even when I support the basic technology. The U.S. nuclear industry is in a state of managed decline. It is explicitly overseeing the decline of the US nuclear fleet from 20% of our electricity to somewhere around 10 or less. And they've got, I think, an inappropriate amount of optimism about these smaller, radically different nuclear technologies, all of which they've tried in the past have been more expensive, too difficult, very controversial. So yeah, for me, and part of my motivation to writing the book was that I just think this is the most important work, is just to get everybody's head screwed on right about nuclear. Because as it is now, you know, solar and wind have about 80% support from the public. Nuclear has only about half of that. And that's just all based on people thinking that nuclear is something that's not, and not seeing it for what it really is.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Benjamin. I'm going to turn the conversation back over to you. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Well, I mean, appreciate the conversation, Michael, and I think obviously there's a lot more that people are going to want to follow up on, both the book or hopefully paying more attention in the world around them to what's going on. You know, at Rand Corporation, we're highly concerned about, you know, the erosion of truth, I guess, in the public discourse and public policy. We've had an initiative for a couple of years now that we call Truth Decay, and there's even published a book on the topic, because we see, you know, objectivity and being able to evaluate evidence at face value as being really critical to making effective decisions in the public interest. And, you know, on controversial topics like climate change, like the environment, I guess concerns me that these things have to be controversial. But on these topics, the best way of sort of vaccinating yourself against manipulation is by understanding evidence, evaluating evidence, and airing issues, digging in the complexity. And so I appreciate the work you've done through this book and prior efforts to, I guess, you know, add transparency and dig into nuances. We're sort of missing and lacking nuanced conversations about the world we live in today and the world we want to live in into the future. So thanks for the discussion. I'll turn it over to you for any last words.
Oh, well, thanks, Benjamin. Well, I think I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate the Los Angeles World Affairs Council for inviting me, and these were great questions. And yeah, I think that I think we're living through really interesting times that we can't possibly understand now, and we're going to probably need another 50 years to probably understand. But I do think these questions of, you know, whether objective truth is possible, and if so, what that looks like, is essential. So thanks for the conversation, and thanks again for hosting me.
Michael, Benjamin, what an informative conversation. I look forward to reading your book, Michael. So
Thanks,
many
Amy.
complex, important issues. Thank you so much. For our viewers, if you enjoyed this program, here's how you can pledge your support. Simply text GIVE, G-I-V-E, to the number on the screen below. We have such a great lineup for you of live streams through the summer and the fall. Next week, July 21st, we have Reimagining Education Post-COVID-19. We also, on the 21st, have a Navigating the Economy in a Time of Troubles, US, China, and COVID-19. Of course, every Thursday, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with Politics Professor Dan Schnur. July 28th, we have a conversation with US Senator Tim Scott. August 4th, Business Ethics, New Rules of Engagement. And we also have a special program with the LMU University on leadership and the challenges and opportunities for higher education on August 11th. So please go to our website at lawac.org to register for upcoming events. And everybody, please stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you soon. Benjamin, Michael, thank you again so very much.